it's the same with what Karin's been talking about when you're trying to get to know the people, your customers, whether it's B2B, B2C, whatever it is. It's trying to create that shared situation definition and that intersubjectivity, because then you recognize where they are and what they need. So I just wanted to make that connection, because intersubjectivity, shared situation definition are all things that have come from the learning sciences. So even when it comes to those initial conversations with your potential customers, we can still learn a lot from the learning sciences. But primarily, what I want to do through the learning sciences today is to think about what's really important about educational technology. And it is this facilitating learning and improving performance. And it doesn't matter whether you're adults, whether you're K-12, whether you're other play settings or informal learning. What you want to achieve is to facilitate learning, and it might be through facilitating teaching, but you want to facilitate learning and you want to improve performance in some way. And so what the learning sciences is going to help us with is, what is that facilitating learning about? What is the learning that we want to facilitate? And what can we learn from decades of research about learning that we can take into the way we design our product or our service? And so for you as EdTech companies, of course, we want to know how you know, and that's what this afternoon is going to be all about. How do you know if your EdTech is facilitating learning and improving? But to start off with, we need to think about that learning. And remember from my cocktail analogy, the learning sciences are the ice, the core ingredient that really must be present, whatever your core base spirit, whatever your mixers, whatever the shape of your glass, there will always have been ice as a component. Even if, like a martini, you don't see the ice in the glass, it's been used in the making of the cocktail. So it's super important. But what is it? What is learning science? Well, I'm going to take you through where learning science comes from, I should say. It's hard because you will all come at this from different places. And as with any educational interaction, I want to meet each of you where you are, but I don't know where that is. So some of you will already know some of the things that I'm saying to you. And for some of you, this will be new. So I'm going to try and navigate a path whereby I hope everybody finds something useful. But there will be opportunities for you to ask questions so that we can try and make sure that we get to what you want to know. And of course, you can always ask me questions over lunch or during the afternoon when we're here. So we'll look at the history and the basic premise behind learning science, where it came from. We'll look at some of the key findings from learning science, very much an overview. We look at the implications of learning science for effective learning, remembering that we want to facilitate learning effectively. We'll look at a couple of examples. We'll look at some design principles that you can take forward and where you can find out more of those. A final example, and then of course I can't really have any talk without saying something about AI somewhere. So I'm going to say something about AI at the end. So that's where we're going. So what is learning science? Well, it's really about the study of learning, but it's the interdisciplinary study of learning. So for many years, we've had researchers working in the social sciences, whether it's education, whether it's anthropology, whether it's philosophy, psychology, and we've had scientists working in computer science and more broadly in interdisciplinary cognitive science, all of whom are interested in learning. And there will be disciplines I haven't mentioned. The point is, this is an interdisciplinary science that's about understanding the process of learning. Now, I said I'd come to artificial intelligence in the end, and I will, but I just want to make the point that the reason AI is as sophisticated as it is because we've got machines who learn really well. This is a machine that can learn really well. But we need to understand what that learning can be, what it is, how we support it. And there's huge amounts of research that can help us understand the learning process more. And if we understand it more, we can build better educational technology products and services to support the learning process that we want to support, whatever age or type of learner you're talking about. Now, it emerged in the late 1980s when these disciplines came together, and literally people thought, we need a science of learning. We're all looking at learning and we're all coming at it from different perspectives. Let's get together and see what we can understand from each other that will enrich all of our understanding of learning. Oh, click happy. So it is the study of learning. And through these collaborations between different disciplines, we have come forward in our understanding of learning. And we're able, from learning science, to provide some principles that can help guide alternative ways of learning, alternative ways of education. So this is looking, yes, at schools, colleges, universities, but also at informal learning settings. It's not specific to any particular educational setting. It's across all of those settings. And it's very much focusing on what is the learning that we need for our future world, our future environment. So that's where it's come from. And we have an International Society of the Learning Sciences. And actually, if you are really interested in the learning sciences, I'd go to their website, because there's lots of really useful resources on that website that you can use to learn a bit more about the learning sciences. So the core premise behind the creation of learning science is this belief that we really need deep conceptual knowledge and skills. That's what we want our education systems to provide for our students. But often, actually, our formal educational environments aren't doing this. So we need a science of learning that can help guide the way both our formal and our informal learning experiences are designed for the future. We know, and we're hearing this so much at the moment, in so many conversations, that actually there's huge amounts of evidence, for example, from cognitive science, that shows that actually we need to get beyond surface level facts, memorization. Memorization doesn't lead to understanding, and we need people who understand. So the science of learning is about helping people gain that deep conceptual understanding. It's about coherence, it's about connection, it's about authentic contexts. I was thinking as Karine was answering your questions that it's impossible to place a value on the authenticity that somebody like Karine brings to the conversation about anybody trying to sell to an educator, because she has decades of experience of being sold to. And so that authentic experience is enormously important. But any learning needs to consider the authentic context. And as Rachel said first thing this morning, context. We must have context. Learning science is all about thinking beyond just the transactional view of learning, but thinking about the all-important learning context. And so the argument can be broken down in this kind of way. So we have this notion, and Karine said egg box school. And as you were saying, egg box school, I was thinking actually egg box school is not just about the physical infrastructure. It can also be a way in which we conceptualize the learning, can be very much seen as being a bit egg box-like. That's not what we want. We don't want this compartmentalized knowledge. We need it to be something that aligns with the real world. I'm really struck when I'm asked questions about AI tools like ChatGPT. Super useful, super useful. But no matter how sophisticated the text or the images that these generative AI tools produce, they are not connected to the real world. And understanding is only understanding if it's connected to the real world. So this is very much what's at the core of the learning sciences. It's how is it connected? How is the learning we're trying to achieve connected to that real world? And so, oh, sorry, I went the wrong direction with the, whoops, with the, So as well as the authentic context, we need to have this deeper conceptual understanding. So it's not service level facts, it's not memorization, it's a deep conceptual understanding that we are after. And of course, it's challenging. All of you are selling into a context. And perhaps that context is a school context. The majority of hands were K-12. You can't on your own change that context. So there is a challenge, and Karen did visit this in her presentation. You know, we want people to be developing the kinds of technology tools that are going to help build the future understanding, and yet you are, of course, constrained by the existing understanding and understanding the pain points in that existing context that teachers, educators, parents, students are operating within. So this notion of connected and coherent knowledge can be super helpful in this respect. So we don't want individualized, decontextualized, egg box learning. We need learning to be seen as something that's connected and coherent, and about knowledge that is connected to the authentic world, so that people can apply that learning and move beyond this notion of distinct subject areas. I talk a lot when I'm talking about AI, but specifically about human intelligence, which is always the context within which I discuss artificial intelligence, and talk about the need for interdisciplinary understanding. So all of the challenges, I'm going to say all, it's very unusual for an academic to ever say all about anything. All of the challenges that we face in the world today are complex and cannot be addressed by a single subject area alone. I mean, just look at the pandemic. How many different disciplines had to come together in order to help us deal with that? Medicine, logistics, engineering, transport, it was everything, wasn't it? You know, and this is the case. So interdisciplinarity is fundamental, connected, coherent knowledge. We've talked about authentic knowledge already. And again, something that we've talked about already this morning, the importance of learning in collaboration rather than in isolation. Collaborative learning is very powerful. And technologies can be an enormous enabler of collaborative learning. Of course, it can also be an enabler of personalized, individual, one-to-one interaction and learning with some technology. But we shouldn't overlook the fact that it can also be a key connector for collaborative learning. And again, for any of you who are interested, there's a whole research area with a website called Computer-Supported Collaborative Learning. Again, huge amounts of resources available through that learned society. It's interesting, Karen was talking about getting to know your customers by looking at where they meet, whether that's on Twitter, X, or whether it's on Facebook, or whether it's at a conference. It's also useful when you're trying to understand the learning sciences to actually think about, well, where do the academics who've been studying this all get together? And so, yes, there's the International Society for the Learning Sciences, which also has a conference, by the way. And there's the Computer-Supported Collaborative Learning, which is also something that is an organization and has a conference. There are lots of places you can go for more information. But does this resonate with you? So as you're sitting listening to me and you hear me talking about interdisciplinary knowledge and facing the future and collaboration and connected and interdisciplinarity and authentic context and deep conceptual knowledge, does that resonate with the product, the service that you are developing? And I'm going to come to you, Daryl, because you put your hand up as saying you were developing something for not K-12 and not adult education. So I want you to say something about what you're doing and whether anything I've said so far has any resonance for you.
Well, thank you for that. Yeah, it was just an extension. Much of our work is focused on ECE, early childhood.
Right.
But the foundations and sort of the principles of what the company's called iBloom, the foundations of the service and product basically resonates through all education sectors. And I think what we're finding is the good work that's going on with practitioners and teachers in the EC has much to share with the rest of the educational sectors. And we haven't paid enough attention to the work that they're doing. It's an underpaid group and doing amazing work. So anyway, that's it.
That is so interesting. Early childhood, actually, there is something specific I'm going to say about just one very particular thing about early childhood later. So it's really interesting. I've often felt that myself, because I've been lucky enough to teach across all different age sectors, from young learners to secondary school to further education to professional education to higher education. I have often felt that actually all of those sectors could learn a lot from early childhood education and the methodologies that are used in early childhood education. Now, you were talking about play, and actually I think somebody else talked about play and STEM over here. And again, play is something that's so fundamental to those early years. And I think, you know, play is really important for learning, and we don't just stop. That doesn't just stop when you get older. There is still some element of that there. Thank you, Daryl. I think, Jocelyn, were you also somebody who put your hand up to say you were working with not K-12? Could you say, can I ask you the same question? Can you say something about what you're doing and also whether this resonates with you so far or not?
Okay. Our target audience, target customer is the newborn family, because we are using, we integrate so many methodology by the neuroscience. We aim to unlock their baby potential. So we work on this 12 years.
That's so interesting. And actually my early childhood example is from neuroscience. So that's kind of interesting. Thank you for sharing that. Yes, I think that's really interesting. So we really have got from the cradle, perhaps not to the grave, but cradle to much older learners within the room. So that's brilliant. Thank you for sharing that. So, no, I did not quote you that one. So I've done some sort of, here's the basic argument, here's where it comes from, here are some components: collaborative learning, authentic learning context, connected, deep conceptual understanding. But what does that imply for the characteristics of effective learning? Well, I think it does. And this is a conversation that we had yesterday, and I apologize for referring to yesterday. Not most of you weren't in the room yesterday, but we had a really fascinating discussion yesterday that Rachel asked the question whether there was a tension. I hope I'm repeating this correctly, Rachel, whether there was a tension between personalization, which we hear huge amounts at the moment, and scaling. And we had a really interesting discussion about, well, actually, if we think beyond personalization being dictated by a computer, in other words, an adaptive system that's deciding for me what I should be doing next and how much support I've had and should have next, to one where I'm in charge of the way the system adapts to me, you get a whole different take on the scaling. So when I say customized learning, each child receives a customized learning experience, I don't necessarily mean that's dictated by a computer or by a teacher alone, though it might be, but it can also be something that is driven by the individual learner themselves. So it's really important to make that point. It means that if we're going to build systems, whether that's an education system or a technology product or service, that speak to the science of learning, as we're thinking about it here, we also need to consider the availability of diverse knowledge sources. So what is it we're providing to our students when we're building our STEM education system, for example? You know, we're encouraging them to do experiments. Are we giving them a really wide range of different knowledge sources? Are we bringing together a rich repertoire of knowledge sources and making those available to them beyond just our product and service in some instances? Because this is where we think about the context within which our product or service is going to be used, because that's super important if it's going to be something that's really going to do that important facilitation of learning. You know, is it something that we're thinking of as just standing alone? Or is it something that can be used with other resources? One of the growing bodies of research that speaks to the question of whether a particular technology product or service is facilitating learning and improving performance is what's called implementation research. because the same product or service being used in different locations by different people is in many ways a different product or service. And the way it's implemented, the way it's used will have a profound wonderful experience because I watched them. I was there with the video camera, videoing what they were doing, and we were capturing video from the screen as well. And I watched them look round like this to see if I was watching. I'm recording you. Of course I'm watching. As they worked out how to cheat. But what was really interesting is that once they'd found the model answer, they then deconstructed the model answer and actually went to ever such a lot of trouble to create one of the best answers that any student group created. But what was also interesting was that for this resource to work really well, it had to be integrated with other knowledge sources. You know, originally when it was designed, we thought, oh, this is a multimedia CD-ROM, encyclopedia. This is going to be it. You know, you won't need books, you won't need additional teaching, you won't need other sources of knowledge because this is going to be the product. This is going to be the thing. But actually, that really wasn't true. Yes, it was useful, and certainly we learned something interesting about different ways of structuring material on a CD-ROM, some of which supported learning better than others. But what we really found was that it was not just the CD-ROM, it was the way that it integrated with the other parts of the learner's experience. What were the textbooks they were using? What was the teacher doing? What were they doing in their classes? What was available in the library? Do you see what I mean? So in thinking about the design of that CD-ROM, we also needed to take all those other knowledge sources into account. So it was a very interesting experience. Further implications that we get from this: collaborative group learning. Students learn together as they work collaboratively on authentic, inquiry-oriented projects. So, yes, we know that students can work effectively together, collaboratively together. Actually, it doesn't happen just naturally. What we know from the learning sciences, from psychology, from education, from other forms of social science that have looked at the collaborative learning process, is that actually you have to structure the collaborative process for learners. It doesn't just happen naturally because you put a group of learners together. And so if you are thinking that your product or service might be one that is going to be used by groups of learners, not just a one-to-one experience, then you need to think about what we know from the learning sciences about how to structure collaboration effectively. How do you introduce collaboration? How do you help people to collaborate effectively? What's the difference between cooperation and collaboration, for example? And the learning sciences can give you a lot of useful information about the nature of collaboration. And you'll notice they're inquiry-oriented projects. This is speaking to the belief from the learning sciences that we need deep conceptual understanding. And that comes from being able to ask good questions. And that's what this inquiry-based learning is talking about. How do we help people to be curious, to want to ask questions, and through those questions to deepen their understanding? And then we come to the very tricky subject of assessment and testing for deeper understanding. I think the way in which technology can enable us to create far more sophisticated methodologies for assessing, tools for assessing deep conceptual understanding is one of its key strengths. So every time somebody uses some technology, we collect some data. And as you'll see this afternoon, that data can be extremely useful for helping us to understand how effective that product is at facilitating learning and improving performance. And part of that is about assessing. So because technology enables us to constantly, continually collect data, and usually multiple forms of data, and again, this afternoon, we'll look at what different sorts of data exist. It can also really help to create new ways of driving assessment so that we can start to think about assessing that deeper conceptual understanding. And the final example I'm going to visit will give you a very, very specific example of what I mean by this in a very practical sense. But I think technology has huge power when it comes to helping that assessment for deeper learning process. So we want to support deeper conceptual understanding through technology. We can really help to support the assessment of that deeper conceptual understanding. So I said a couple of examples, and I said one of them was about early learning, and I said you spoke to neuroscience. So here we go, and I didn't know that. So neuroscience is one of the areas that is that interdisciplinary space of the learning sciences. And I think neuroscience is fascinating, and I think increasingly important, particularly when we're thinking about comparing artificial intelligence and human intelligence. There's a lot we can learn from integrating insights from neuroscience. And obviously, in a talk like this, I can only scratch the surface. And what I'm trying to do is create little points of contact with you where you can say, oh, I didn't know that. I can go and look into that now. I know that there's something here. I'll go and have a deeper look at this. And this is one of these. So, you know, understanding brain function reveals learning difficulties even when students seem to be coping well. There's so much richness in the neuroscience literature about the invisibility of learning. For example, yes, we can look at learning difficulties. We can help to see, literally see, the type of learning difficulty that a learner may be suffering, experiencing, trying to cope with, when we may not yet have picked it up in their behaviour. So it can be supremely useful for that. But it's also really useful for realising that the student who's like this isn't necessarily not learning. Now that we have neural interfaces, and it is possible, it's scary and there's lots of ethical implications, but You know, we can monitor what's happening with increasingly low cost and light technology. Yeah, we can't do the complex fMRI that neuroscientists often use, for example, but we can capture neural information. It might be that that student is actually generalizing from what they've just heard. We look at them, we don't see that. They're not interacting with a computer. We can't capture that. But actually, neuroscience can help us understand, oh, actually, if we can learn from what's happening at the neural level, when we realize that the student that looks like they're gazing into space is actually learning. So neuroscience is opening up huge possibilities, particularly through the fact that there are ways in which we can now actually, as I say, quite realistically, in the real world, start to gain information from the brain, but challenging ethically. And I said I'd say something about younger learners. So here's my neuroscience example. So brain research on literacy has been hugely insightful for language learning and for things like looking at the difference between students who work best when they're dealing with whole language or real books approaches to reading, this kind of thing, and others who find the systematic breakdown of language through phonics. It's been enormously useful for helping to understand more about that. But it's also shown that actually language learning is most effective at younger ages, which we may not have thought. All of those secondary school students who are introduced to a new language in secondary school, actually they probably would have done better if they'd been introduced to primary school, for example. So neuroscience is really helpful in this respect. Oh, this is one that speaks to so much of what gaming and gamification is about. So brain studies show emotions strongly impact on learning and memory. I remember when I first started my studies as an undergraduate, and I won't name the year because I do like to have some privacy of my age. We really didn't understand the connection between emotions and learning. What's happened, and particularly from neuroscience, but also from psychology and education and sociology, is that we have come to realize the huge connection between emotions and learning. And so we know, for example, that actually some stress does enhance learning, but excessive stress impairs cognition. So balance. I was steeped, as was Ekaterina here, in the work of a Russian psychologist called Lev Vygotsky. Ekaterina has the advantage over me in that she speaks Russian, so she could read the original. I only have read the translated English version of his work. But he talks about something called the zone of proximal development. And I can see lots of nods, so lots of you know what the zone of proximal development is. Now, we can think about the zone of proximal development through a spatial metaphor as being the difference between what somebody can achieve on their own without assistance and what they can achieve when they have assistance. It's beyond what they can do on their own, but if we assist them, they can achieve this thing that's a bit more challenging than where they are at the moment. We can also think of the zone of proximal development as something that needs to be created through interactions between teachers and learners, or between learners and learners, that will speak to this little piece here. Some stress, some extension, some taking you beyond what you can do can be useful for learning, but you need to be supportive because excessive stress impairs cognition. And so another useful piece of evidence that you can go and dig away into if you're interested that comes from the learning sciences, and in this specific case, neuroscience. And here we have the informing assessment. So assessment, and it doesn't matter, perhaps with your very, very young babies, although there's still an informal assessment that you're probably going to be doing. And with early childhood, we don't like to think of assessment in quite the formal way, but actually there's a lot of assessment in early childhood education. You know, and so thinking about the way in which what we're now understanding about the brain structure and the plasticity of the brain structure is really interesting when we're thinking about personalized learning and informing assessment, and then realizing that actually what somebody can do today is not something that's fixed, and that we now know that even in terms of the composition of their brain, that can change. You know, and this is really important. So we need the kind of assessment systems that speak to the fact that lifelong learning is a reality literally from the cell structure of our brain to those wonderful social interactions that we have with each other. So again, a lot we can learn from neuroscience, and that's part of what learning science is all about. And this is my second example. And I think this is one that will be something that it doesn't matter where you are, whether you're K-12, higher education, informal, whatever, this is something that I think is really important. One of the very significant findings from the learning science has been in relation to what's called assessment for learning or formative assessment. So thinking about not just a stop and test approach. So you do your subject learning and then you sit an exam. That's summative assessment. This is not just about formative assessment, but assessment for learning, formative assessment. So assessing people as they're learning, but where the target is not just the assessment, it's the learning. In other words, how can we use the way that we're doing peer assessment, self-assessment, questioning, sharing learning expectations, feedback, how can all of these different ingredients help learning? So assessment for learning is all about unpacking the way that we help somebody understand the extent to which they are learning using multiple different types of assessment ingredients. And it's useful for educators, and it's incredibly helpful for the student themselves. As I said earlier, when Rachel asked her question yesterday about the tension between personalization and scaling, the discussion that we then had was very much about, well, it depends who's doing the personalization. Is it me for me? Is it a machine for me? Is it some combination of both of those? Now, if you become very good at assessing your own learning, then you become a very empowered learner. So assessment for learning is about the teacher and about the learner. And it's broken down, and there's a large literature that, again, if this is something that you feel is relevant to your product and service, I would encourage you to search for assessment for learning from the learning sciences, because there's some very useful work there. It's also really interesting when you're thinking about promoting equity. That we talk a lot about meeting learners where they are. And that can be in terms of academic, but it also could be in terms of where they are in their lives, where they are demographically, where they are in terms of perhaps having a challenging home experience. And so thinking about assessment for learning in its richest sense, you can really help to identify ways of empowering struggling learners. So it's a very powerful tool in the learning sciences toolbox. We can certainly look at how it can move us beyond the one-size-fits-all, view of what a classroom's all about. We can think about it in terms of, the really detailed feedback. As part of the artificial intelligence and education research community, I know that for years I've gone to conferences and heard very impressive work being done on the nuances of feedback. You think perhaps in your platform that you're developing, you're going to feedback to students, whatever it is they're learning, or teachers, you give them feedback. We saw in Duolingo the real importance of feedback. But we are now able to look at precise wording of feedback. What kind of words actually motivate your students, engage your students? I had a PhD student, actually, so Katerina's PhD supervisor, I now realize, was previously my PhD student. And she did a really lovely piece of work in a classroom scenario where she looked at ways of feeding back to students which were informed by theories about growth mindset. And some of you might have heard of growth mindset. So this is the notion that linked to the plasticity of the brain, that actually we don't have fixed intelligence. We can grow, we can become more intelligent. And she looked at some research which was done by Alison Dweck that looked at the difference between students who had what was called a performance-based mindset, where their aim was to score the highest score, and students who had a mastery mindset, where it was all about understanding. And actually they were happy to make mistakes if it meant that they understood the material well. So it's very different to performance. Now, actually, as it turns out, and this was with primary school age learners, as it turns out, very few children are actually at one extreme or the other. Most of them are somewhere along the spectrum from between being motivated by performance and being motivated by understanding or mastery. But what she did was some really lovely work where she integrated into a gaming environment different ways of feeding back. The language of the feedback was worded differently. And it was really interesting seeing how the wording made a difference to the way it encouraged a mastery mindset or a performance mindset. So even you might think, I'm going to give students feedback. Well, how are you going to word that feedback? The learning sciences can help you to nuance the way you word that feedback and make sure it's as effective as possible for your particular students. And certainly another really important part of this assessment for learning example from the learning sciences is thinking about different ways of trying to capture learning. And again, this is where your technology is so helpful. You know, many, many years ago, Karine, this might have been the case when you first started teaching, but I don't want to make you sound older than you really are. Oh, okay, fair enough. You know, but most of the assessment was paper and pen, and actually it still is, you know, but everything was paper and pen. Okay, so now we can do capture data through technology. Yeah, and I remember the math. You know, you can capture data through technology, and I don't just mean answers to questions. I mean mouse clicks, keyboard interactions, speed of interactions. There's lots of different data we can collect through the computer that can complement data that we've collected in other ways. Maybe we still do a pen and paper test, but we've got all this other data as well. And so assessment for learning speaks to the fact that we use lots of different data sources to try and help us understand more about the learning process and feed that back to the student to help them understand about more where they are. So did I cover that last thing? Yeah. And learner approaches. So I'm very lucky. As a professor in the UK, you're allowed to choose your title. I don't mean you can say, oh, actually, I'd rather be a lord or a lady than a professor. I don't mean that. I mean, you're a professor, but you can say, am I a professor of... So I chose learner-centered design because for me, the learner is at the center of everything we do when it comes to learning, or they should be. And so learner-centered design is actually something that really comes from the learning sciences. But it doesn't mean it's individualized. It just means that the learner is the central phenomena when we're thinking about what we're doing, whether it's assessing, whether it's teaching, whether it's supporting, whatever it is, the learner is at the center of what we're trying to do. And assessment for learning, despite the fact that it says assessment as the first word, is about enhancing learning and teaching, not just measurement. So I'm going to come to somebody else now. So you've worked out that since I picked on Daryl and Jason, that now I'm going to come around and pick on other people as well and ask you what your product or service is. And some of you have already told us, so you'll be repeating yourself, and I apologize for that, but we may have forgotten. And then ask you if anything that I've said so far resonates with you. I'm going to come to you. Erdi?
Yeah, nice. So we are Ketowen. We create AI assistant for language teachers to be able to let them create adaptive lessons, right? And then what we do is like we try to, what resonates the best with me is the part you said, you make, you get lots of resources available for the teachers. You get them pick what they want to use in the classroom. So what they can do with our platform, if they find a video, or a piece of news or a story interesting, they can come to us and we help them to turn it into a lesson that can be suitable for their students' language level. Yeah, and we are trying to give them the freedom to choose from whatever they want, not like to fixate in a certain reading lesson.
That's really interesting. And I think it speaks to that point, many of them, but particularly I'm thinking about the multiple knowledge sources. It sounds like you're helping educators to pick from multiple knowledge sources and then to create from that. So there's a nice connection there. I'm actually going to come to Sean now, which is dangerous because he knows about the learning sciences. But I'm going to ask him to speak to this question. What is your EdTech? And does anything I've said resonate for you?
What is our EdTech?
Something you're using.
Learning management systems
Right.
as an EdTech, and they're not being used to their full capacity. And I think coming back to your talk about connecting knowledge is one important thing, but feedback and mastery, how these tools can be used to give feedback in a process and for learning, and ways of encouraging students to think beyond the feedback or the assessment that they've been given. Too often, faculty members give absolute language in their feedback. This is excellent. This is really good. But what next? Going back to CPD, well, what next? What should you be doing, right? And how can we make use of EdTech as the learning management system as an environment to provide and give that feedback and get students to reflect on it and then advance further on?
That is such a great example, because learning management systems are used so widely. And so to think about how we could utilize them better is extremely important, because it's out there. It's a technology that's out there. Many years ago in the UK, we had an education secretary called Charles Clarke. So, Karine, how many years ago is that? A couple of decades at least. And he's a lovely man. I'm still in touch with him. And he was very enamored of the interactive whiteboard. And so it's him that's really responsible for that almost every school in the UK has an interactive whiteboard. So that's a technology that can just be a glorified projector or a very powerful tool for learning. And it's a bit like the learning management system. It became a ubiquitous technology, but I would have to say that its use was mainly underwhelming and did not speak to all of the possible ways it could be used. So I think what you're saying is really important. If we're thinking as EdTech entrepreneurs, if we're thinking of people who are really trying to leverage EdTech, let's think about some of the tech that's actually already out there and how we can make it better. I do think that's a really important part of this conversation. Thank you, Sean. That was a great example. Thank you. You must have had lots of experience with the interactive whiteboard, Kerry.
Most schools only use it, as you said, as a whiteboard, because again, when you put to school, no language.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, sorry.
So this was another example of a product market fit. When it came into schools, there was no explanation of what everything it could do and how to use it, and nobody to show you. So lots of people didn't even realise it could do anything else. I'm not being funny. So because the developers didn't tell the teachers, and the teachers didn't know any different, so they just used it as the whiteboard. And when you went into another school and found, my goodness, it can do X, Y, and Z, it's a bit like having a computer and using 1% of it. You didn't know, and then the technology had moved on, and we're still at this stage. We've wasted all that money and that time when we could have changed the dynamics of how we were teaching and learning. So yeah, sorry.
No, it's great. Sorry, you've got to say that again. Sorry, just for the.
So it's not just that the faculty don't know that it can do that. They don't know why it's been developed to do it that way. That's the issue.
Yeah, it's such a good point. And going back, so learning management systems, both across all age groups, and actually interactive whiteboards as well. And interactive whiteboards are used in higher education as well as in K-12. So they're both examples that are relevant across the board. Thank you. Oh, Daryl.
Sorry, this might be a little bit off topic, but I'm curious in terms of your research with this. From my understanding, in terms of if a student requires a scribe to answer to do an exam because of a broken arm, their scores automatically increase by 5 or 10%, regardless of sort of across the board. And I was wondering what your research was saying in terms of reasons for that.
That is such a good question. I can think of some explanations, but I would need to know more about the precise nature of the context and what was going on. But there's certainly the learning sciences would have lots of resources to help with that explanation. So we know, for example, from work done by somebody called Michelle Chi, who is now at Arizona State University, that self-explanation is a very powerful learning tool. And so it could be that as the student is talking to the scribe, they are self-explaining and increasing their own understanding, and therefore increasing the quality of the answer they produce. Do you see what I mean? So that self-explanation process is absolutely something that comes from the learning sciences and could be an explanation for precisely what you're saying. But obviously we need to know the precise nature of the type of task and what's going on. But I would be surprised if self-explanation wasn't part of the explanation. Katerina, would you agree? Do you suggest anything else that might be specific given your background and expertise?
No, that sounds
You think, yeah, you'd agree. Fair enough. Thank you. Right. Yeah. Daryl, do any questions other people have? We will have questions at the end, but do feel free to ask as I go. Okay. So in terms of practicalities and where you can go to find out more, it's also true that Pearson is a huge publisher, but not just a publisher, a producer of a lot of different educational technology products, have had a massive project over the last few years that has basically put to task some very, very able researchers to go and read masses of learning science research and pull it together into a set of principles to help designers, to help improve the design of educational technology. So it's well worth going to look at. And so what they have done, and I'm literally just going to scratch the surface, but at the end of the slides, which I assume will be shared, we're certainly happy for them to be, there are some references where you can go and find out further information. But they have unpacked, or perhaps collated, curated, and in order to explain the learning sciences principles, have created 4 lenses. And each of them is phrased like this: learning happens best when. So there are 4 of these, just to give you a heads up. So learning happens best when it's welcoming experience. And that's to do with motivation, which we've heard a lot about motivation already, and mindset. And I've talked a bit about mindset. And social and collaborative learning. And within each of these, motivation and mindset, social, there are a whole set of design principles that you can get from Pearson that would help you if this is something you're interested in for the design of your service or product. Second one, learning happens best when it's built for how minds learn. And then we have a set: developing understanding, attention and cognitive load, desirable difficulty and scaffolding. Remember that point from neuroscience about stress, and a little bit of stress is quite good, but too much stress is bad. So desirable difficulty, active learning, practice and memory, feedback for learning. We've already looked at assessment for learning. So again, if you go to the Pearson website, they have looked at the literature that's relevant to these different principles and unpacked it into design guidelines. Fourth one, learning happens best when it's purposeful, outcomes-based design. And we have objective design, assessment and evidence-centered design, personalized learning and adaptive instruction, authentic learning. You will recognize the language from my earlier slides: authentic, assessment for learning. It's all coming back. And this is where Pearson have surveyed the literature and pulled it together into these 4 lenses and a set of principles. And the last one, which is the one I'm going to unpack for my final example, it's learning happens best when it supports good learning behavior. Self-regulation and metacognition is the principle here. So really recommend that you go and look at this design toolkit. And the reference I give, because there's lots of it in different parts of the Pearson website, is actually a lovely video from somebody called Catherine Muckaldoon, who is one of the key researchers on this project at Pearson, where she takes you through the principles. But there's lots of very useful information that's designed specifically for designers, for people building products and services. But I just want to dwell on self-regulation and metacognition. Firstly, because I believe it's fundamentally important to learning, and certainly to learning for the future. It speaks to so much of learning science. We are now starting to understand amazing things about our ability to reflect on our own cognition. Metacognition, to come up a level. It's something AI can't do. That the extent to which AI has metacognition, and there are people building metacognitive AI, by the way, it's so rudimentary that we wouldn't call it metacognition if we were talking about people. This is where we really are supreme. And there isn't an AI that can do this like we are. But it doesn't happen naturally. We have to build it. We have to help people develop their metacognition. It is very powerful for helping people learn. Free resource. There is, I think it's already been mentioned, there is a Mandarin version of this book, but unfortunately it's not free. It's published by Cheers in Beijing, but the English version of this book is now freely downloadable from this link. So, and there's a huge amount of explanation about metacognition and about learning sciences and lots of other things. And although it has a very young learner on the cover, it's not relevant just for young learners. It's for learners of all ages. So you can get loads more information about lots of this learning science, and in particular, metacognition and self-regulation. But I want to give you one very specific example. I want to highlight that the reason I think this is particularly important, and it's a learning behavior, is that we think about this guy in the middle, we're trying to unpack, and this comes from the book, what human intelligence consists of. And I don't mean separate intelligences. These numbered 7 things are not separate intelligences. There are different ways in which we can view human intelligence. This here is accessible to AI. In other words, AI can do a lot of this. Not all of that social intelligence. Meta-knowing is about being able to understand what knowledge is, where it comes from, what is good evidence that something's true or false. It's what helps us make good decisions about what we believe and what we don't believe. This here, on the other side of the screen, not accessible to AI. So as we think about supporting learning behaviors in humans, that's the stuff that really, really matters for the future, depicted in this diagram slightly differently. So the stuff in blue is stuff AI can do. The stuff in orange is stuff AI can't do. So, hey, gosh, we can. Let's build on that, shall we? So metacognition is one of them. So I'm going to give you a very specific example that relates to what I said would be a final point about artificial intelligence, but it also speaks to what we've said about assessment for learning. It speaks to what we've said about data and using data effectively to understand the learning process and to support the learning process. So if we think about something like metacognition, it's a very complex human behavior. Now, this here is missing deliberately to remind me to say to you, there's a whole load more about metacognition, but I'm just going to look at this aspect of metacognition, what we call procedural metacognition, process-based metacognition. Declarative is about being able to say accurately, I know or understand X, Y, Z. The process is the process of learning. So as we're learning, are we planning effectively? Can we regulate? Can we monitor our learning? Can we control our thinking, rather, metacognition, cognition, but really with respect to learning? Can we reflect and we feed that back into our own understanding? So this is about the process of metacognitive, being aware of our own thinking and being aware of our own learning. Now, if we think about technology, here's just a little example of the kind of data that we know we can collect as people are using technology, that we know in some very, very small way helps us understand the extent to which they are behaving in a metacognitive way. So if we think about monitoring control, remembering that's just one little box in the way that I was unpacking metacognition, and I'd oversimplified the way we can unpack metacognition. And we can think of just one example of self-regulation in terms of monitoring as we're learning. Are we monitoring what we're doing? We can think about screening, prioritizing, the kinds of aids that we can give people as they are learning to focus their attention more effectively. And then here's the kind of data that we could collect that will help us know whether we have somebody who is going through this process of screening and prioritizing. So we can look at the way they highlight. Do they highlight things as they're learning? Are they annotating? Are they commenting in some kind of discussion forum? You know, as they're using the mouse, what are they doing? Are they tracking across the text? If it's text, what are they doing with the image? What are they doing? We can track all this back. Opening, closing, creating new tabs. We all do that, don't we, when we're using our web browser? I look at some of my colleagues with horror when I see the massive number of tabs they have open, because I'm one of those people who doesn't have a lot of tabs open. I have lots of pages open, which is not an effective way of working, but it's such a bad habit that I've created. But other people have masses of tabs open. You know, what is this saying about us? You know, viewing the progress bar. We can see if somebody's mouse is moving over the progress bar. Or if we were really lucky, we might have eye tracking data that tells us where they're looking on the screen. My point here is that the way people use the technology that you build can tell you massive amounts about the learning behavior that they are enacting. And understanding the learning behavior can help you understand really important things like metacognition. I am not saying that this process here will tell you all about metacognition. It's just one little ingredient. But just imagine all the ingredients that you can collect as somebody is using your technology. So you can really start to understand learning behavior. And the way that we have formulated tables like this, maps like the one on the previous slide, you know, this categorization, which is, as I say, extremely oversimplified, is from looking through all of the research done within the learning sciences, mapping that research and thinking, what does it mean in terms of the kinds of data we can collect as somebody's using technology that will tell us something about their learning behavior. And in this specific example, to do with metacognition. So I said my final point would be about AI. Imagine you have hundreds of data points, each of which is a little ingredient. Maybe you've got hundreds of data points about somebody deleting annotations, about them running their mouse over a progress bar, about them opening tabs, whatever it is that your technology enables them to do. AI is your superpower for analyzing that. We think about AI at the moment often through the lens of generative AI because that's something that's being talked about in the media. But AI can be your superpower for the analysis that you do of the data that you can collect as somebody is interacting with your technology product or service. And it can really help you to understand learning behavior. And it helps you to understand learning behavior through applying the learning sciences principles in the way that you do the analysis, the way that you apply the AI tools to the analysis of your data. Now, I'm not expecting all of you to be able to do that overnight. Of course, it's complex stuff, but I'm trying to give you the vision of where we can go with this and the fact that you can really start to combine the learning sciences with advanced technologies like AI being used for analysis and really superpower your technology, your ability to say to people what your technology does, to demonstrate the way that it is addressing the market need that you are trying to address. Right, I will finish on this just to say, I realize one of the things I haven't said is I also host the EdTech podcast, and we have a series coming up, which we've recorded most of it, specifically on AI and education. If anybody is interested, it's free. You can just go to the EdTech podcast, also to our website. The other thing I'm trying to do, and again, this is a free newsletter called The Skinny. And although you think, why is she talking about the AI when this is supposed to be about learning sciences? But this tries to pull together what we understand from learning sciences, what we understand from AI, to help people understand what these powerful technologies can do for us as we're building education technology, as we are educating people. And these are the references or the bibliography. I could have put hundreds or thousands of references at the end of this talk, because there are hundreds of thousands of references that are relevant to all that I've tried to pull together. But these are some kind of key ones, particularly this Sawyer one, which is quite an old one, but it's really where learning sciences started, if you like, although it's 2014, there was an earlier version of it. And Sawyer is one of the kind of granddads, probably would hate me for saying that, of the learning sciences. So well worth looking at, but also things like this little clip that you can watch from Catherine about the Pearson design principles. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm really happy to answer any further questions. I'd love to know if that's been useful for you. As I say, it's an awful lot to cover in a short period of time, and I've tried to give you some pointers that I hope piqued your curiosity, and that now you think, oh, I never knew that was the case. I'll now go and look at that and see how that's relevant to what I'm doing. So questions, please, and I will give you the microphone. You've got another one, Darryl. Yeah, and then I'll come, right, I'll come to you, then I'll come there, and then I'll come over there.
I could ask in terms of just looking forward a bit from your perspective, like there's a lot of apprehension and sort of wary of AI coming forward. And so I see a massive disruption coming within the education sector, particularly for teachers, the next couple of years, sooner than we might think. So how are you viewing things from optimistically or reservations?
Such a difficult question to answer. Some days I feel optimistic, some days I feel pessimistic, and I'm not being flippant in that answer. For 29 of the 30 years I've worked in the area of AI and education, I've been optimistic. This year I've become less optimistic, because unfortunately what's happening at the moment is being driven by profit margins, not by what's good for education. So I have to say, but I do agree that there is massive disruption coming, but that's a huge opportunity for all of you. It really is. I'm coming here, then I'm going there, and then I'm coming over there. Oh, okay, thank you.
I really love your talk, because it gives me ideas to reflect on what we've been doing. And so in the last 6 months, I've tried most of the top AI apps for learning development. And also try to use it for different contexts like sustainability and mental health for workplaces. So I'm combining different apps to create images, create videos, create quizzes. And one of the things I have been researching on, and it's really why I joined this workshop, is how do we use learning science to back up our prompts when we put it into ChatGPT or, even Midjourney. Because, for example, when I'm creating learning objectives, if I say to ChatGPT, create objectives for me, and then it will say, understand this, understand that. It's all understanding. But if I say using Bloom's taxonomy, so I'm thinking whether there are any resources or what's your opinion on, for us to professionally have these prompts then actually backed up by learning science.
That is such a good thing to be doing, to be thinking about how you prompt in a way that's informed by learning science. I love that. I think that's great. I think I would say first thing, go and look at those Pearson design principles, because I think that will give you some ideas about prompt engineering that you can use. And that, I think the work that I was talking about earlier about growth mindset and thinking about the way you word, and you could give ChatGPT or whatever examples that you want it to copy and to use as it's generating. Yeah, there's so many ways you can use it. That's such a great idea. Yeah. Oh, do you want to say something?
And just coming back to having the right level of stress, now I'm thinking in the ChatGPT, if I'm trying to create a story or scenario, I'm gonna say give the learner some stress,
A small amount of stress. And actually, yeah, looking for key papers on stress, and that could be a really good thing to give as an example. Great stuff. I love it. I love it. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah.
So I really enjoyed your conversation, and thank you very much for actually sharing so much about AI and education, which is a space that I've been very interested in for a little while now. Kind of like following on from Ivy's comment as well as yours, I wonder if there's a third force that is shaping the future of education, and one that would make us even less optimistic, where we have what's good for the kids, we have what generates profit, but what are the organizational imperatives? What is the organizational inertia? We know that interdisciplinary learning is better, yet universities and even secondary schools are organized in terms of departments. Yeah. Anybody who does anything innovative in terms of interdisciplinary studies never gets tenure, and they wash out, and they end up dead, right? So basically, there's actually, this actually makes me less optimistic, and there's actually two ways to deal with it. You build technology that's actually going to be revolutionary. You build a change model on top of that, and you try to be simultaneously a social and tech entrepreneur. Or you actually try to say, hey, these are the constraints I face, and I try to build a technology that will get adopted by existing organizations. But at the same time, I wonder if the entire higher education space, for instance, is going to collapse because the US educational systems, for instance, it's so oriented towards research that frankly isn't very useful. So at that point, some point, there will be a political reckoning. And I'm actually very curious about your thoughts on both dimensions. First of all, how close is the reckoning, given the organizational imperatives? And on the other axis, we can actually look at whether you build tech for innovation or something that you can do within the organization that will still do as much good as possible within the constraints.
Oh my goodness, that's so we could talk about that for months, years. It's really important what you're asking. I recognize what you're saying about interdisciplinarity, and it's not just within the higher education. For years, I've done interdisciplinary research, and I recognize what you're saying. It's a hard career path. It's a really hard career path, and so you get your research funding. You actually get some interdisciplinary research funding. You do some interdisciplinary research, and you train your researchers to be interdisciplinary researchers. Where do they get a job? Where's the interdisciplinary lectureship? There isn't any. The lectureships that they need as their next jump are in psychology or geography or math or computer science. But then we look at the school system. I was fortunate enough to go to the University of Sussex when it was an interdisciplinary institution. It was founded on interdisciplinary. It was quite like any other university in the UK. It was founded in the 1960s on interdisciplinary principles. It didn't have departments. It had schools of study, things like African and American studies. and you do psychology in African and American studies. It was the only interdisciplinary university in the UK. And I became Pro Vice Chancellor of Teaching and Learning in the October after it reorganised away from being an interdisciplinary institution. And it reorganised away from being interdisciplinary because it was too hard to explain to students. And then I sat in meetings where everybody went, how do we look different? And I was like, no, you were different. You were different and you didn't like it. So now you look like every other institution and you want to look different. You know, so I feel the pain. Honestly, I really, really do. And it's across the education system. And yet we know interdisciplinarity is what we need. We need in the workforce. We need. So to your question, I think the demise is coming. Yes, absolutely. And it's for multiple reasons in terms of organisational imperatives. A lot of them funding in the UK. So the higher education system, for example, is facing a huge funding crisis. And I don't know. There are some vice chancellors who recognise that things need to change, but we don't know where it's going to go. The workplace wants people with interdisciplinary understanding. They are, in increasing number of instances, placing less emphasis on the formal qualifications. So is the system going to change around our education institutions? In which case, if you're thinking of designing your product or service, you might be addressing it for what's here and now, but actually maybe in 5 years' time, you'll be behind the curve. Do you see what I mean? So it's really hard, isn't it? Now, whether there's a way of finessing this, where you start from a point of contact with where people are now, but you are trying to build something that pulls them along that journey, I don't know. I'd like to think so.
So maybe you actually build. I mean, the way I approach it is actually to build current generation technologies meet current needs, but use that as a Trojan horse to kind of like pull them in a certain direction.
Yeah, I think that's it, because we have to recognize, you know, as Karine said, you know, the person who's going to be buying and using your software is stuck in the environment they're in. As I say, I was Pro Vice Chancellor. I walked into my office. I knew what I was facing because I'd been, you know, Director of Undergraduate Studies at the same university. I didn't agree with the reorganisation. There was nothing I could do. So I knew when I took the job of Pro Vice Chancellor, I was walking into the institution just to reorganised away from what I believed in. But that was the reality for me. I couldn't change. I'd done everything I could to change it, and it made no difference. You know, so we have to meet people. You're right. But yeah, the Trojan horse, I think, is the way forward. And it's exactly what I meant. So I'm definitely, we are in a shared situation definition. We have intersubjectivity, I believe. So thank you. I just want to come because you did have your hand up to ask a question. I don't want to miss you out. Sorry.
Right. Yeah, actually it really builds on the interdisciplinary nature of all of these. When I was doing my PhD back then, I did develop a formative assessment, actually trying to bring learning science, cognitive science, and education and computer science together. And the challenge there was you end up building something not very formative assessment, because formative assessment is still very much restricted in teaching and learning, and therefore kind of still curriculum aligned, right? But when we do interdisciplinary research, we want to promote interdisciplinary skills. And so at that time, I was building something on computational thinking, which is, you know, a future interdisciplinary thinking skill, but not exactly a subject on its own. And so the challenge really lies in researcher finds it helpful, but when it's integrated into the classroom, some teachers buy it, but other teachers like, well, like how do we position this? Because this is not exactly curriculum aligned. So my question is really, well, actually I've been drawing while you were speaking, whether there would be a potential for assessment for learning to assessment for self-development. So what if we think about assessment, even though it's, you know, still very much learning oriented, but it doesn't have to be in a classroom. It could be for self-development, where all the potential of interactivity, immersive gamification, mastery of skills could be still developed in how we would develop assessment, but outside of that context of formal education.
Absolutely, I love that. I think that's great. And I think there's ways in which you could use AI to analyze the data and powerful visualization techniques so that you could really show learners, show teachers how they were developing, you know, their self-development journey. I think it's a great idea. Yeah, I love it. Karine, I know you wanted to say something, so I think then we probably have to stop. But
the question that was, the question that the gentleman at the end asked, he came and spoke to me, and I didn't quite understand. Please.
I think there is a glimmer of hope. Okay.
whenever you have a big disruption, COVID was a huge disruption, wasn't it, to us? And what we've seen is a lot of children haven't gone back to school. Okay, lots of countries, they haven't gone back to school. Mass worry for me as a head teacher. You know, when I was a head teacher, well, why haven't they gone back to school? Or is this telling us that we've been developing things because we think the parents want it, but actually the parents don't want this? They're not all convinced they want this now. Because the interesting thing for me is the amount of children that haven't gone back. We did a survey as part of EdUCATE, and it was huge amounts of children that have not gone back to formal education. So if that can be a glimmer of hope in a different way, because whenever something massive happens, we look to the negative, don't we? It's dreadful, but actually what's the positive side of that? And the positive side of that is where the assessments and of how we're going to reassess the children who don't go back. We're going to open up new opportunities and new ways of learning, because what people were saying is actually when our children were at home, some of them did much better in the environment in which they did it. So we've got to have a balancing somewhere along the line. You know, what happens is when you have a mass disruption, everything sort of seems to be, we're looking at the negative all the time, but there's always glimmers of hope. And I wonder if that's going to be a catalyst for change on a number of fronts, so that some of the things that we have been knocking against a closed door, we can now open up. Because you're quite right, as a head teacher, I had to balance this plate and get the score on the door in order. Well, I had to do that bit, because there were certain things I had to make sure I ticked. But actually what was interesting was this bit. Okay, so that's where my focus was, but it took a lot of energy. It took a lot of my time. And actually, you know, that effort is sometimes you can feel, what am I doing it for? Because you can lose your job in an instant if you haven't got the scores on the door. So for me, I wonder if COVID has given us a different, unique opportunity in terms of the children that haven't gone back, and how we're going to have to visualize learning for them. And some of the things that we thought parents and other stakeholders believed in is now being tested by, because if they believed in it, why haven't they sent them all back to school? What is it about school? Why haven't they gone back to formal education? Sorry,
I think it's great to stop on a glimmer of hope. Oh, we're not going to can I do one more? I know we're going to overrun a bit, but can I do this? But I do think a glimmer of hope is a very, very good place to end up. And I think, yeah, let's see opportunity, you know, in the situation. And for EdTech, I think this is a huge opportunity.
Thank you.
Final words.
Thank you. Thank you, Rachel, for asking me consistently so that I really come today, because this is very, very far away. And it's really, really enjoyable in this morning that I hear from Rose about the latest development of your research. And actually, we are also doing something to connect machine learning with the neuroscience to enable primary school kids to be develop their self-regular learning. And we are riding on the generative AI to do something that hope we can help the primary school teachers to do something. This is really difficult for primary school teachers about developing the young learners self-regular learning. But I think this is the way to go, because the next round of generative AI is not just by probabilistic. It may be rational in a few years' time. So it doesn't mean, as from your framework, in framing the future development of the differentiating what AI can do and what the human can do, I think even we have a rational generative AI. I think school teachers still are the core, but the skill has to be changed drastically from previously to a more guiding students to develop their capability in the meta-cognition dimension, and that is really challenging. And I heard from one of the colleagues here talking about what they are going to do for using the generative AI. I think if they are moving in the direction for EdTech company to develop chatbot to enable students to do better using this generative AI for support their self-regular learning, is really, really fantastic, but it's really difficult. But please try, because we have to do it by ourselves now, but I think if some support is really important. So thank you very much, Rose.
My pleasure. Thank you very much. And actually just listening to everybody, I do hope there's a way of this group staying together, because I think there's lots of common threads, and a lot of the things you're talking about are quite big issues that you're all going to face and that are relevant to all of you. So I'm just really struck by the fact that there's an interesting group here, and hopefully by the end of the day, when you've been working together on logic models this afternoon, there'll be even greater shared situation definition. There we go. I think I should stop there, because I've gone over a little bit. I'm just going to pass the microphone to Rachel, but thank you so much for your great listening and great questions.
Rose, can you, for the online audience, because they can't join in the afternoon, what can they do if they are fascinated by your workshop this morning? What could be the next step for them?
There's so many possibilities as next steps. I think if they want to get in touch with us, we can talk about because it depends what they need. There's lots of different ways in which we can help. We've got lots of free resources that we can point to. We've got courses. Gosh, we've got a whole range of different courses, Rachel. So there's so many different ways that we can help. But hopefully there'll be future workshops that you'll be organising that they can join in as well. Because I think if you've got a taste for what can be achieved by adopting this approach, then we want to help you, because I think it's really important. I also think, as I say, there's a huge value in groups coming together, because as an EdTech entrepreneur, it can be a very lonely journey, can't it? And actually being part of a group where you realise, oh my goodness, they're facing exactly the same challenges as I am. Might be that mine's K-12 and theirs is higher education or whatever, but actually there's still some very much shared challenges. So I hope that helps to answer that question, Rachel.
Ask them to complete the feedback.
Oh yes, of course. Please complete the feedback form. Yes, please, 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 I beg of you. Yes, definitely. That would be extremely helpful. Is it available for the online audience as well? Yeah, of course. That's fantastic. Thank you so much. And I can see lunch has been delivered at the back. So is there any, oh, it's all labelled, of course. It's all beautifully organised. Right, lunch is available at the back, and we're back at 2 o'clock prompt, won't we? Yeah. For getting down with your logic model and your theory of change. Thank you so much. Real pleasure.